Well, thank you very much. I'm John Corvino.
And I'm Matthew Anderson.
It's a real privilege to be here at Wheaton College. It's particularly a privilege to be here with my friend Matt Anderson. And people are often surprised to hear me say that. They say, wait a second, how can you, as a gay man and an LGBT rights advocate, be friends with somebody who argued vigorously against your right to marriage? And the answer to that question is really very simple. I drink.
When we first did it, we've done these dialogues a number of times, and when we did our first one, we called it A Gay Man and an Evangelical Walk into a Bar. But
It's a true story.
It's a true story, yeah. That was the original name for this. But we decided at Wheaton College that might not work. So we went with a slightly more tame title for it.
I was relieved to see there are bars nearby.
There are.
Okay.
It's true.
But it'll be a while before we get there. But we're going to start by talking a little bit about our background, how we came to do this, who we are. Then we're going to talk a little bit about marriage. We're going to talk a little bit about religious liberty. But as Dr. Baycoat said, the really exciting part of this is the dialogue we have with you. And so we look forward to that dialogue. We actually started this, it must have been about 12 years ago.
Yeah, we're old.
Me especially. But we met at an event that was a kind of behind-the-scenes meeting of people involved in the debate around same-sex marriage. It wasn't advertised, it wasn't recorded or anything, but they decided to put a bunch of us in a room to see if we could find common ground.
It was actually worse than that. They brought us to a cabin in the woods.
It really was.
It was like the beginning of a horror movie.
And they wanted to see if we could find common ground, which we didn't. We did not at all. But what was interesting, it's funny, the week or so before, they had brought in people involved, this is also a true story, they had brought in people involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they said, those people were easier to deal with than you all, just want you to know. But one of the interesting things that emerged from that is that some interesting friendships developed, because we found that the really deep and important conversations didn't happen during the sort of formal circle when we were sitting around. They happened afterwards as we were just sitting, chatting, and getting to know each other. And through that, we developed a friendship and a dialogue, and then started doing these kinds of dialogues. And as Matt said, the initial title, when we did a couple early versions of this, was A Gay Man and an Evangelical Walk into a Bar, because what we were trying to do is sort of suggest what it's like to have a casual conversation over beer or whatever you may drink, and to share that experience with other people, and that's what we're going to try to do tonight.
That's right. John wouldn't even let me wear a tie tonight because he was so convinced that it needed to be a casual conversation. So,
and because we usually wear jeans.
That's
actually.
True. Yeah, we've dressed up. For
we dressed
Wheaton.
up for you. So, do you want to talk?
I just want to keep making jokes.
No, apparently.
Yeah.
No. So let's introduce ourselves, and that's going to get a little bit more serious. So part of the interesting background to our friendship is a sort of contrast. We are politically very different. We are religiously very different. We have very different background stories. As I mentioned already, I am a gay man. I am also an atheist. There was no audible gasp. I was worried that there was going to be an audible gasp. There was no audible gasp. But my sexuality and my religious background, like so many aspects of our identity, are sort of interestingly intertwined. So I grew up actually devout Catholic. I can see the evangelicals in the room thinking, that's where you started off wrong.
And they're not wrong.
I grew up a devout Catholic, and actually at one point during high school had planned on going into the priesthood. And part of the process of discernment as I prepared to go into the priesthood was thinking about sexuality, because I was about to commit my life to celibacy. And of course, they want you to, before you do that, make sure you know what you're getting into. And partly through conversations during retreats about that, and partly through, at that point in my life in college, meeting other openly gay people for the first time in my life, I finally came to the realization that I was gay. And it was an interesting kind of moment for me because growing up, I knew that I had quote-unquote gay feelings, but I insisted that I was basically straight, even though I did not have any straight feelings, and even though I knew that if you have gay feelings and no straight feelings, you're probably gay. But there's an interesting kind of human tendency. If you have these thoughts and you don't let them touch in your head, you don't have to draw the natural conclusion. And for me, as someone who would go on to be a philosophy professor and teach basic logic, it's interesting to look back at that time in my life. It's like you had these ideas in your head. How did you not figure this out until college? But I did figure it out in college. And part of what I decided to do at that point was to take some more time on the outside before going into the priesthood. And I mention that in part because I want to make it clear. A lot of people think that, so you were angry at the church and so you left the church. No, my leaving the church actually had nothing to do with being angry at the church. In fact, I had a very positive experience of Christianity and the church during my coming out process. I was at St. John's University in New York. My theology professors, philosophy professors, campus ministers, various people I knew and worked with there were really loving and supportive. It was really for philosophical reasons some years later, as I thought more about my reasons for faith and reflected more upon my experience, that I came to believe that I didn't have good reasons for faith in God and lost my faith in God. And so I would now characterize myself as sometimes a religious skeptic, sometimes an atheist. I'm not a fanatic about it. I don't go door to door. I don't burn big question marks on anyone's lawn or anything like that. It's not a sort of like a crusade sort of thing for me. It's just I don't have faith. It doesn't mean that I don't believe in anything larger than myself. In fact, I think one thing that Matt and I have in common, even though we have very different positions on the existence of God, we both recognize that we are not God, and we both approach this dialogue and these kinds of issues with a certain humility because of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like John, I think I ended up here partially because of my experience, in fact, in large part because of my experience, though my experience was of a very different sort. I was raised in what we would call an evangelical household. My father was a pastor of a small church, and like many people who came of age in the early 2000s, I spent a lot of time wrestling with questions of marriage and sexuality, in part because I had no script. I had no template for how to enter marriage well, and I found myself doing considerable amounts of damage to those who I cared about along the way. And so out of that, I really invested a lot of time in trying to figure out fundamentally why people get married. It didn't make sense to me. Even though I'd been raised in the church, even though I'd been told that it was something that God had established, there was some kind of gap there. It's probably the fact that I'm dense. So I'll give you that, but there was some sort of gap there that I couldn't quite overcome. It just didn't make sense to me that someone would sign up for a whole life with one other person. And so it was through that process of working through that set of questions and trying to reflect on my own experiences and how I'd ended up hurting so many other people that I found myself thinking about questions of gay marriage. It was at a time when gay marriage was starting to be a realistic possibility on the horizon, and I've always been a petty controversialist and found myself engaging those in public on questions of whether or not the state should support marriage. But for me, it was very much, whether the state should endorse gay marriage. But for me, it was very much an outflow of my deeper conviction that as a culture and as a society, we had lost touch with the sort of thing that marriage is. We have generally forgotten what it felt like to be married well, and we didn't have a clear vision for what marriage could be. And wrestling with that is really how I ended up thinking about gay marriage so much. It was a byproduct for me and not by any means the main concern.
One of the things that was always interesting to me about the marriage debate, and maybe based upon what you said, it was interesting to you as well, is that the marriage debate so much became a gay marriage debate.
Yeah.
Even though you would think that it would invite us to be more thoughtful about the institution of marriage, what it is, why we have it, what aims it's supposed to serve, and so on.
Yeah, you would hope. And I think on the conservative side, and we're thinking retrospectively about this now, right? Like we're looking back at a decision that the Supreme Court made, and so gay marriage, the approval of gay marriage is now the law of the land in our country. And so looking back at that and looking at the conservative response to that upheaval, I think there was an attempt to try to explore the reasons and to explain why marriage should be limited to a man and a woman. But I think it's a challenging thing to make that argument, because what you're asking a conservative to do is get behind roughly 2,000-ish years of social and political thought about an institution and to recover why it was there in the first place. And that we couldn't do that effectively in a culture in the 25, 30 years that it took between, gay marriage being just an idea in someone's head and it being reality, is to me entirely understandable. It went very quickly, and it took a long time for the world to figure out how gravity worked, right? Like that's not, it's a basic thing, how that apple falls from the tree. It's very obvious. It does that works. But explaining that takes a long time. And there is a sense in which the conservative response to marriage flailed about a little to try to find reasons. We did what we could, but the reality is, like, we're talking about intuitions that are so foreign to most of us, that are so buried beneath a divorce culture, that are so buried beneath a culture saturated in pornography, that are so buried beneath, a culture of brokenness on these issues, that it's really hard to dig out the intuitions that would make a traditional view of marriage plausible to a society. So
and
we
I
lost.
Yes. No, so, I mean, one of the things I want to underscore here, because you identified a shift in marriage with the Obergefell decision from 2015, and of course, that's an important moment. That's when marriage becomes available for same-sex couples all across the United States. That was the first time that my husband and I, who have been together now for 18 years, but that was the first time when it would be possible for us to marry and have marriage recognized in our own state. We were married the following year, legally. But I think part of what's misleading about that is it looks at sort of one aspect of marriage, which is the legal aspect, which is a very important aspect of marriage, and I don't want to downplay the importance of the legal incidents of marriage. I sometimes say, marriage is for better or for worse, but the legal incidents become particularly important during the for worse, because what they do is they establish somebody as your legal next of kin. But marriage, of course, is a lot more than that. Marriage is, among other things, an interpersonal commitment. Marriage is a social institution. And I think one of the reasons why the debate became as complex as it did is that those things were all sort of moving at different speeds. So you had, obviously, people making interpersonal commitments and even expressing vows to each other. You had those recognized within certain communities at certain times, even if they were not legally recognized. And then all of a sudden it seemed like, okay, there's this sort of big blanket thing that happens in 2015. But what happened in 2015, in my view, is in part the law catching up with what individuals in society had been recognizing for quite some time.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think that the society had shifted, and I think there's a real question about whether or not the law should respond to those sort of shifts. I think if a law is too disconnected from where the citizens that it is meant to represent are, like if there's too much a disconnect there, I think that's a real problem. And I think someone like Thomas Aquinas thinks that. C.S. Lewis actually makes that point in an introduction that he writes to a book. And so law needs to reflect where a society is at for it to perform its function. But it seems to me the question of marriage is different than other social upheavals that we've had in the past, because this one isn't going to go away. And this one is so pervasive of an issue for religious believers that the threshold for how a society is going to change, I think, is much higher, right? Like there's going to be, let me just rephrase that. I think there's going to be a much larger percentage of the American population who will just never change their views on marriage. It's a very sizable chunk of us. And I think that even though the culture had started to shift, what Obergefell meant was the end of deliberative discourse about that. The conversation, in one sense, was finished. And that's the function of the courts to do that. The courts have to make limited judgments to put an end to conversations. You can't argue about things forever, much as I think I would like to, and maybe John would like to, too.
You said a moment ago you're what is it, controversialist or
petty controversialist.
Petty controversialist.
Yeah.
I don't think of you as a petty controversialist.
Oh, thank you. Do you think of me as a grand controversialist?
No, because I think that there are a lot of people who like, stirring up controversy for controversy's sake. And one of the things I was going to add when you were talking about the marriage debate and how that went down is that it was very much colored by the fact that we are in a social media age where so much happens in terms of like Twitter sound bites, so much happens in terms of sort of these sort of cheap slogans. And I get why that happens because sometimes they work, they move people.
But slogans are the worst. Can we just agree on that?
It depends on the slogan, I suppose. Mom and apple pie. I don't. But, I mean, it's slow. But look, I do think that you and I both think that there are these sort of sound bites that come from both sides that are, at best irritating and at worst sort of deeply problematic in terms of deepening our understanding, even when they're well-meaning.
Yeah.
For example, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. One of the phrases that bugs me. We were talking about phrases that bug us. So one of the phrases that bugs me: love the sinner, hate the sin. Now you might think, now come on, I mean, love the sinner, it's about love. How could you be against love? What's wrong with you? It's like being against pizza, or I don't know.
Love is love.
Love is love. Right?
Love is love.
Talk about slogans. Talk about slogans, right? It points out that we can love one another even though we're flawed. That seems like a good thing, right? All of that seems good. So why does it bug me? Well, for one thing, it often seems like a kind of code. When people are talking about the sin here, they're not talking about tax fraud, right? We know what they're talking about, and that's sort of one problem. Love the sinner, hate the sin, but it comes up with specifically this sin, because not all sins are created equal in this one. The other piece of it is that we're not talking about some sort of isolated misstep in your life. It's like, I was mean to my sister yesterday, or I fudged my tax returns or something like that. We're talking about our life-defining relationships. We're talking about our significant others. We're talking about the people to whom we make these public commitments, such that it changes us, right? And we do things to mark the fact that it changes us. We might wear jewelry permanently. We might change our names. We do these various things. And in that sense, these things become kind of life-defining. So drawing this sort of sharp line between what we do and who we are is not as easy. Because some of the things we do, and particularly these kinds of life-defining relationships, are constitutive of who we are. They're deeply a part of who we are.
Yeah, there's a lot that we could talk about there. I mean, I like your
We're here to talk.
I know. Your category of life-defining relationships, I think, is an interesting one. It's much better than identity, which is not a term that I have much patience for. I mean, if we're going to pick on phrases, though, John, you just have to, I hope, agree with me that the right side of history is a phrase that should have never entered public discourse.
Well, the problem with that phrase, so one of the things we do in philosophy is we teach, fallacies, and one of the things we talk about is begging the question. Begging the question is when you assume as a premise that what you need to prove is a conclusion. You've evaded the question. You've acted as if we've already settled something that we're in the process of trying to settle. Since this debate is about what is right and wrong, what ends up being the right side of history is supposed to emerge from the debate, and trying to use it as a premise in the debate is like a perfect example of a question-begging point, in my view.
That's a very abstract way of putting it. I mean, it also...
I'm a philosophy professor. That's what I do.
That's the abstract is your game. I mean, it also has a sense of just superiority embedded within it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it frames the people who are on the, quote, wrong side of history as old, right, as outdated, as no longer current or relevant, as consigned to the past and thereby able to be forgotten about.
Dare I say, it suggests that we have a God's eye view about history.
Ooh, yes, you may dare suggest that, as long as we're talking about the same God. But I think the use of that slogan and the use of slogans within the debate, as you pointed out, so much of the marriage conversation in America was mediated by social media, was mediated by videos, and as a result, extremely complex positions got reduced to sound bites, and nothing constructive came from that. If anything, attitudes and dispositions were formed in the American public, I think, that resulted in, when gay marriage became the law of the land, a genuine hostility towards those who had opposed it, right? A genuine sense of, dare I say, animus towards traditional religious believers who now, even now, think that same-sex marriage is not sort of God's will for the world, to use that sort of language. And so I think that the use of slogans and the use of sound bites in that debate poisoned the well in a lot of ways for reasonable public discourse after Obergefell happened.
Which brings us to the important topic of religious liberty.
Yeah.
Because so many of those debates right now are framed in terms of religious liberty, and particularly religious liberty for people who do not wish to recognize, participate in, sanction same-sex relationships as marriage.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so John Roberts, in his dissent to Obergefell versus Hodges, basically flagged this point up, right? The way in which Obergefell versus Hodges framed religious believers was as bigots, right? There's no sort of category that a religious believer could have. There's no way they could object to same-sex unions without being a bigot.
Yeah,
and
I think, by the way, that is an example of perhaps the Chief Justice's most overblown rhetoric anywhere in his writing.
You think so?
Yes, because I think Justice Kennedy in Obergefell, and certainly in more recent opinions like Masterpiece, goes out of his way to, I mean, he even says in Obergefell that, there are decent and honorable premises on both sides, and nowhere uses the term bigot. Bigot, I think, becomes one of those conversation stoppers, both when people on my side use it by saying, oh, you're a bigot, Matt, which is a way of saying, look, you don't even belong in the conversation. Your views are beyond the pale. But also when people on your side, like Chief Justice Roberts, say, oh, you're branding me as a bigot. No, I'm saying that your view of marriage has functioned to exclude people in a certain way, and I'm detailing the ways that has been harmful to them. But, to suggest that Justice Kennedy paints this brush of everybody on the other side, everybody is a bigot, there's just nothing in the text that I think actually backs that up.
Yeah, that's fair. That he doesn't use the term bigot is obviously the case. Framing religious believers as causing harm by virtue of their religious beliefs, I think, would give good reason to call all religious believers bigots, right? And that did happen throughout the course of the gay marriage debates, right? The judge in California in the Prop 8 case basically said, religious believers, by virtue of their religious beliefs on these issues, are harming gay and lesbian individuals. And we hear that certainly in popular discourse. The idea that religious beliefs on these issues are contributing to gay and lesbian suicides is probably the number one argument against my position these days.
Really?
Yeah. It's the one argument that I hear more than any other. If I say that I think that marriage is limited to a man and a woman and that sex outside of that union is morally impermissible, the instant response is, you're contributing to gay and lesbian suicides.
You have the blood of the children on
I've
your
got
hands.
the blood and I've been told that time and time again by relatively well-known figures in public. And I think that position, that religious beliefs on this, that my religious objections to this practice, my philosophical objections to this practice, are intrinsically harmful to individuals. To me, it means that there's very little room for public discourse, right? Like there's very little room to disagree with the Chief Justice when he worries about conservative religious groups being branded as bigots.
So there are a couple things I want to say, and then we could say more about Masterpiece, but we could also open it up for, I don't know which direction you're leading.
I'm game for either.
Okay. So I want to do a sort of both and move here and say...
It's not allowed.
Yeah. Right, nuance, forget it. Yes, I think that there is a tendency to kind of ratchet up the rhetoric in such a way that, if somebody disagrees with what you say or somebody disagrees with what I say, it's not enough for us to just be wrong, but we become these sort of monsters who are responsible for all of these other ills, and the blood of the children is on our hands, and so on. And I've gotten that kind of rhetoric from different directions.
Right. Christians have their own form, right? Which is you're sending people to hell.
Yes. I think that is true. And I also think that it is true that these debates that we have, these discussions we have, don't happen in a vacuum. How we conduct them is important. The kinds of rhetoric we use during them can have a real effect on people, can have a real effect particularly on vulnerable people, particularly on vulnerable young people. And, so I think that gives us a responsibility and an obligation. And I think that the danger is that we feel like it becomes so fraught with, oh my God, if we do this wrong, we're going to drive kids to suicide, so let's opt out of the debate altogether, which I don't think is the answer.
Right.
I think that at least part of the answer is that we try to do it in a way that really models the kind of care and respect that we genuinely feel for the various participants. And one of the things I've appreciated about you in the years that we've been doing this, and just not in the years that we've been doing this, but in the years that we've been friends, is that we're able to have that kind of nuanced back and forth without jumping to question each other's motives and to accuse each other of these sort of grand sweeping effects.
Yeah, I think that's, I appreciate that. That's very generous of you. And I think what you say about needing to make these claims in certain ways is something that I've tried to say internally within my own community at great length. It's not enough to issue prohibitions on certain actions if we are not willing to accompany those who fall beneath those prohibitions and extend our love, care, support, and grace to them so that we can empower them to abide by those prohibitions, right? If you're going to say no to same-sex unions, then you have to support and accompany those who are gay within your midst to ensure that they do not fall into temptation and to help them not fall into temptation. And I think that there are lots of ways in which my own religious community has failed to do that. And the thing that impresses me about John is that he is able to tell a complicated story about those he deeply disagrees with. And I think that's something that we too often lose when we engage in these debates, that partly we started with our narratives to try to say we all come from somewhere when we're making these arguments. We all have backgrounds that matter. And while the experience of gay and lesbian individuals in our country has been used very effectively to advance LGBT rights, those who are on the opposing side of that have their own experiences as well. And things are just much more messy than the headlines would tend to allow. And I think John sees that and is capable of working through that in a way that I really value. Do we want to argue some about religious liberty? Because we did say, beforehand we joked that the one takeaway from tonight is that on religious liberty, I'm for it and he's against it. So
if you don't have a lot of room in your notebook, just write that right now. Speaking of a nuanced discussion,
yeah, right, there it is,
and fairness to your opponent's actual views.
I deserve that.
Yeah, no. Look, what do I want to say? Because part of the challenge here, because I really do want to talk to the audience. And so let me give now a quick soundbite take on what I think about religious liberty.
Give us a slogan, John.
Yeah. So my slogan is buy my book, Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination, available at fine bookstores near you. Or check, I've got YouTube videos on this as well. But
they're very funny.
Notice he didn't say good. He said funny.
I mean, they're all wrong. They're very funny.
But part of the problem is that these cases are all sort of sensitive to the facts, and the facts differ from case to case, and you don't want to make these kinds of blanket pronouncements. I think that the main thing I want people to understand is that once you start two things with respect to a case like Masterpiece. If I'm just going to say something quick.
Just outline the case for us.
Okay, so
just very briefly.
So 2012, Charlie Craig and David Mullins, a gay couple, walk into Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado. They are flipping through catalog pictures of these various wedding cakes. The owner of the bakery, Jack Phillips, comes up to them and says, "May I help you?" They say, "Yes, we'd like to order a cake for our wedding reception." In 2012, same-sex marriage is not yet legal in Colorado. They are going to be married, I believe, in Massachusetts, come back home to Colorado to celebrate the reception. Jack Phillips very politely says, "I'm sorry that this conflicts with my religious beliefs. I cannot sell you a cake for your wedding. I'm happy to sell you other things in the store. I'll sell you birthday cake, cupcakes, cookies, whatever, but can't do that." Couple leaves. Whole exchange between them takes no more than about 90 seconds. Files a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. Colorado prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, among other factors. And Jack Phillips is found liable for not giving them the full and equal enjoyment of the services of his shop under Colorado law. This works its way up to the Supreme Court. Everyone is expecting the Supreme Court to give some kind of sweeping decision that either says, no, Jack Phillips, you have to follow anti-discrimination law, you cannot refuse to sell cakes to same-sex couples for their wedding, or sorry, but to this couple, but he has religious liberty rights and free speech rights, and if he doesn't want to express endorsement by creating a cake for your wedding, he doesn't have to. But the court does neither of those things. The court focuses on some very specific details of the case where the commission, referred to Jack Phillips' use of his religious beliefs to justify turning this couple away as a, quote, despicable piece of rhetoric, is one of the phrases that gets cited in the case, and also suggests that the commission is inconsistent in its treatment of this case and other related cases, but explicitly leaves aside the question of whether Jack Phillips would have a free speech or religious freedom right to refuse service in another case like this. So the case ends up being decided on something very specific to this particular commission and this particular case. So I think one thing I can say with certainty, and I think you're going to robustly agree with me on this, is we're going to see more cases like this. This has not been settled by the Supreme Court.
They just wanted us to be able to keep arguing about it.
Yes.
They wanted us, you and I, to go around and solve this problem democratically.
Thanks, Justice
in the public
Kennedy.
Square. So,
actually, thanks, 7 justices. It's not just Justice Kennedy.
Right.
It's a 7-2 decision. So yeah, there's a lot more I could say about that, but
Yeah, so I think within that story, John, the question is your earlier language of life-defining relationships and this comprehensive way of understanding same-sex unions. I think the fundamental question of these cases is something like, is there a way of being a religious believer and of claiming religious objections to participating in any form in same-sex unions while still being able to fully participate in the public square by virtue of owning a business? Right? Or is the conflict between the sexual identity of LGBT people and the dignity that they're owed and the religious believer, is it just a zero-sum game and one side's got to win and the other side's got to lose?
So I don't ever want to say that it's a zero-sum game, but I do want to push back on this fully participate in the public square, right? Because the fact is that there are some religious beliefs that limit people's ability to participate in the public square in certain ways. If you observe the Sabbath on Saturdays, you're not going to want to open your business on a Saturday. Or, if you are Amish, you're not going to be a bus driver. I mean, there are things that just sort of are intrinsic to the religion that limit that, and that's not externally imposed. There are also various ways in which laws may be inconsistent with various religious beliefs or convictions that we don't normally think of as problematic. I mean, I may, for moral or religious reasons, be a devout nudist. I cannot operate my bakery in the nude. You should all be thankful.
We are.
I may think that having various kinds of liability insurance is a form of gambling prohibited by the Bible, but if I open a business, I have to carry certain forms of insurance. If my business is of a certain size, I'm going to have to give maternity leave to employees who get pregnant and then welcome them back, even if I think that, a woman's place is in the home taking care of her children, she should not come back to work, and so on. So there are a variety of ways in which the law is going to conflict with certain faith principles. And so I don't think it's just as simple of, are we going to live in a society where religious people can fully participate? Well, it depends on what the particular religious beliefs are and how those come into play with other social values we have about inclusion and fairness to those who go into public places of business.
Good. That's helpfully precise. We can argue more about that, and we
I'm
should,
sure we
and
can.
we will in
And
the
we
Q&A.
will. Okay.
We will. But if you do have a question, we would love to hear from you, and so don't be bashful.
And it looks like there are microphones set
There
up.
are microphones there and there.
And that's not to intimidate you, it's so we can hear you.
Yeah.
Yes, and I will choose who gets to speak, yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, wow.
Which means that I get to ask the first question.
Fearless leader.
There are several that I'd like to ask, but one of the things that I'll ask is in light of the fact that you both teach at universities. And one of the things that, of course, a lot of people are talking about, if you're talking about the limits of agreement and disagreement, if you're talking about what people can say or not say, some people have a concern about the climate, at least on some campuses, about whether or not there are things you can say or not say. It's often a free speech type of question. And some people, of course, want to say, well, no, some things people should not be able to say. You should be shut down. And a lot of times it's around some kind of justice concern where that occurs. Of course, an example would be ways that people want to discuss what you do with statues of people that perhaps own human beings as property, right? And so can you have a conversation about that, or is it already a foregone conclusion what you should do about that? So can you have that conversation or can't you? So it's an example of whether or not you can say many things on campus, or really only certain things can be said. And perhaps you've both heard people say, people at other institutions say, I'm not sure what I can say these days. We used to be able to have back and forth conversation. Now it seems like a lot of the speech is being policed. So, as we're talking about this kind of things, college campuses are a place that are getting a lot of attention about that. So I'm just wondering your thoughts about that.
So I want to draw, it's an easy question to start with. That's nice. I always appreciate
thanks for that.
Yeah. No, I want to start with a very simple distinction between being able to say things and being able to say them without any kind of repercussions or any kind of pushback or any kind of response. And I think that a lot of people complain that there are things we're not allowed to say anymore. It's like, no, you're allowed to say them, but we're going to tell you you're being a jerk when you do. And I've seen this kind of thing happen, around, certain language, around. Usually it happens when people are being particularly insensitive to women, racial minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and they get pushback over that, and it's like, oh, well, I'm not even allowed, my free speech is being taken away. It's like, no, other people are also exercising their free speech. So, well, I don't deny that there have been cases where the pressure against certain kinds of free speech has been excessive on college campuses. I do think that it tends to get somewhat overblown, and I think there's a lot of confusion between that and simply free speech playing itself out in such a way that some people get told when they're being jerks.
Unsurprisingly, I think I really disagree. Yeah. It seems to me that conditions for speech are much worse than that. Like that seems to me a very optimistic account of what's going on. It's not just that you're free to say it and that we're going to tell you that you're a jerk. The consequences seem much more severe for saying things that were benign 5 years ago. Saying, go, and not only that, but the opportunities or the contexts in which people who hold those views are allowed to participate in the dialogue are shrinking rapidly. So I can come here to Wheaton, and this is a place where I can talk, but I'm not sure that I could go to Harvard and be invited into Harvard Divinity School and give a talk on why same-sex unions would be wrong. And we can say that, maybe that's fine. That's just the sort of social pressure that we exert on those who lose culture wars. And that's partially true. That's what, in one sense, winning and losing means. And I don't begrudge people that. But it does seem to me that there is a genuine sense of fear among conservatives that is not entirely unfounded, and a real fear among even college students of every type that one misstep is going to totally ruin their lives. And I think that that's, I organized a dialogue. I ran a dialogue at Biola University, a great school in Southern California you might have heard of, between Robert George and Cornel West. And Robert George is a very conservative Catholic thinker, and Cornel West is an African-American who's progressive. And we had Rick Warren moderating this conversation. It was a great evening, tons of fun. You can see the video on the internet. And we're sending Rick Warren questions from the crowd, and he reaches the last question, and he goes totally off script. And the question of the dialogue is basically like, can people live together while disagreeing? And Rick Warren asks Robert George and Cornel West, should universities have safe spaces? And Cornell just said, no, in only the way that Cornel West can. And it was just fantastic, because there is a sense in which universities of all places are the places where you're supposed to have selective doses of dangerous ideas in order to inoculate you against them for the rest of your life, and to inoculate a society against them for the rest of your life. And if we don't have universities where those dangerous ideas are allowed to be aired in limited, controlled ways, then we will have what we currently see, which is reactions against that society, the rise of really toxic ideas on messaging boards and alternative outlets. And so, if universities don't reform themselves, I think they will contribute to a grave social crisis.
So I want to move on to other questions, but I have to push back against two things. One, you started off by mentioning Harvard, and a few minutes later, you're mentioning Robert George, who a couple years ago had a visiting position at Harvard Law School.
That's true, yeah.
So the idea that at Harvard you couldn't say, you couldn't say it because they already got Robert George in to say it. So, Robert George and Cornel West, that's like the expensive version of what we do. Second, Cornel West, I'll push back against him for a moment, I think just badly misunderstands how safe space is supposed to function. If safe space means that you never have to confront any idea that you don't want to hear, then no, that's not what university is about. But should a university have any safe spaces? Should a university have any places where a student feels like they can sort of retreat for a little bit in order to get themselves together and feel emotionally safe and comfortable so that they can then better engage in the classroom where they are going to be challenged, including being challenged on things that may be deeply sensitive to them for various personal and historical reasons? Yes, of course, because that helps for those students to enable that very process that you and I both agree on, of getting out there and confronting views that you don't necessarily agree with. So I think it's really important for us to be clear on what these things actually are, and I'm disappointed that Cornel West would just so badly mischaracterize what it's about.
To my right, your first question.
So I would say, how open are the both of you to changing your views, and how often do you think you re-examine them?
How often could you say the last part again?
How often would you say you re-examine your views?
Yeah. How often I re-examine them would depend on which views we're talking about. I have a constant state of re-examination of my views of barbecue. Every time I go to a new place and experience a new type of barbecue, I re-examine whether or not I've seen the world of barbecue appropriately. I think that something similar is true of my views on sex and marriage. I read a lot on those issues, and I have I've been reading lots in the Christian tradition over the last few months on sex and marriage. And I think that there are certain ways in which my views have changed as a result. Now, I haven't softened at all on certain core convictions that I've had. I've not seen reason to change my mind on that. But I think the work of examining our positions is one that has to be done from within a framework of givens where we accept certain things as true and we ask questions from that framework and we try to understand the world better. And the longer we can do that successfully, probably the more true our way of seeing the world is. And so until the cognitive pressure builds and I can't just see the world rightly through a situation anymore, until that happens, I generally don't change my mind about something. And I think that I was lucky and was raised with a lot of true beliefs. And so that has happened very rarely for me.
One of the interesting things about, sort of dictionary definitions of bigot is they say that a bigot is someone who is obstinately devoted to their opinions or prejudices. And I'll sometimes ask audiences, how many of you have things that you are obstinately or stubbornly devoted to? It's like, all of us. And if I agree with them, we'll call them convictions. If I don't, we're going to call them bigotry. And so I think that, realistically, Matt and I have both been thinking about these kinds of things for years and years and years. We've both written books about them. And because of that, there are many things we're pretty well settled into, and I don't expect when we get up on stage together that he's going to have a eureka moment. It's like, John, you've been right all along on marriage, or I don't think he expects that from me. That said, I do think that there's got to be a genuine willingness to listen to the other side, to process what people are saying, to really deeply engage with it, because otherwise we're just engaging in a kind of pantomime of let's pretend we're in dialogue with the other side and then pat ourselves on the back and look how open-minded we are. We were with the other side. And we're both striving for something deeper than that. So I'd like to believe that there's genuine engagement, even though I don't expect that it's going to move the needle a lot, although it may on very specific things.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Hey, I'm Tommy, and I'm a junior here at Wheaton. Last year, Wheaton College's group Refuge, which was composed of LGBTQ students on campus, was disbanded due to ideological differences with the chaplain's office. Because of the increasing popularity of LGBTQ student groups on conservative campuses like Baylor, how do you propose that conservative colleges and universities interact with or support these student groups in the future?
So I am probably not the best person to speak to how this might be done at a place like Wheaton because of my lack of background with an evangelical milieu. I actually started my graduate work at Notre Dame in 1990, where we had a gay and lesbian group that was sort of officially disrecognized by the university and would sort of meet, without official approval, and I was very involved in all of that discussion. I think that the main thing I would want to emphasize, I guess two things. One is that those groups and those individuals should be in dialogue with various partners on campus who can function as allies for them. The other is to recognize that supporting a group of individuals as they come together and try to support one another is not the same thing necessarily as supporting a particular set of doctrines that may or may not be in conformity with what the chaplain's office says. But again, that may depend on the details of who's involved and what the group's public positions were and all of that. Yeah.
This is an extremely hard question for me to answer. I kind of feel like you're trying to get me fired. I am at Baylor University, and this is a live issue on our campus, and so anything that I do say is by no means representative of anything other than my private opinion. So here's the thing that it seems to me that a lot of people miss about groups. They changed the nature of what's believed and what's heard in ways that distinguish group dynamics from just an individual who believes that thing. They solidify things for people. And that's why we form them and why they're important. And it's also why a community like Wheaton that has certain norms that I hope to God it never changes, on, say, the inappropriateness of sexual activity outside the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman. A community like Wheaton that believes that has to uphold those norms by setting parameters for how it allows its students to conduct themselves while members of that community. And that's just a basic feature of organizing a society that's inescapable to me. And so I think that what I would love to see universities do is form young people who are gay or lesbian or trans in ways that are fully compatible with the traditional Christian sexual ethic, and provide them the support and the care that they need to abide by that ethic. And I think that for a long time, Christian colleges presumed that their students would abide by that ethic, or they just didn't want to have to deal with it. And that left a vacuum, which I think is unsustainable. So I do think that universities have to think of themselves more as, having a pastoral authority than they have thought of themselves as having, and take that very seriously. That doesn't answer your question, but it's a really hard question. I'm trying not to get fired.
Well, let me just add one thing about that, just given the nature of refuge, because it predates anybody that's an undergraduate here at Wheaton College. So the environment of refuge is kind of like an oscillating thing, depending upon what the leadership was, right? So I think it's important, however one thinks about why it went away.
Yeah.
And there were people definitely disappointed about that. So I think that's, people can debate that. But it's important to recognize that it was never a constant type of thing. It depends upon what students are there,
yeah,
and how animated they are towards Wheaton's stance about sexuality during the time of refuge. So it's really kind of oscillated during its history. So I think that's just important for context, and also since this is also being recorded. So,
Yeah, that's helpful. I know
because
nothing about
otherwise
this.
somebody thinks, oh, we can shut down refuge, and then because
Yeah.
blah blah blah. It's like, well, refuge has not been static. So I think
That's helpful.
that's an important thing, I think, just to say for public record.
So in the past, was it not always associated with sexuality and
Oh,
gender?
no, it was always there for sexuality and gender, but the students who were in it weren't always in the same level of dissonance with Wheaton's stance about sexuality. So a lot of times that had to do with what students were involved with its leadership.
Got it.
And which of course is going to fluctuate like every couple of years, depending upon who's
Yeah.
in charge, who graduates, all that kind of thing, right? So that's the thing I think is important to recognize. It was kind of fluid in that way.
Yeah, that's
So,
helpful.
I mean, that's the way it is with every student
Yeah.
organization, right? So I just think that's an important thing to say, because otherwise it can come off as if, oh, well, it was always this way or always another way.
Right.
So it's an important qualification I want to make.
Okay, so my question's a little long. I'm going to read off my phone because otherwise I'm going to forget, so pardon me. A group of Wheaton College students is currently suing the city of Chicago because they were forced to leave a public place when they were handing out literature and evangelizing peacefully in Millennium Park, a public park in downtown Chicago. Although the park is a public place and an open access area, they were told they would be forced to obtain permits and could only evangelize in certain areas of the park, or would risk arrest if they did not comply. The students were ejected by park officials, a clear violation of their First Amendment rights. How can you justify your individual positions on religious liberty in cases like this one, when the First Amendment rights that we cherish as Americans are being violated? So I'm really challenging you, guys.
So, because I don't know the relevant Chicago ordinances, because I don't know enough details about that particular place, it's hard for me to make sort of general conclusions about whether people's free speech rights were violated and what. I mean, it may be that you're absolutely right, and that the city of Chicago should lose this lawsuit. It may also be that, Chicago has decided that there are certain parts of the park that are sort of no proselytizing zones, no leafleting zones, and sometimes people want to go to the park and not want to be bothered by leaflets, whether it's from one group or another group, whatever group it may be. And I think it's actually okay to designate certain zones of the park that way as well. My belief in free speech doesn't mean that I think that in any place I go in public, I necessarily need to be inundated by leaflets. So without knowing all of that other stuff, I don't feel comfortable issuing forth a position on that particular case.
Yeah, I think I'm going to agree with John's judicious approach here. I mean, when we talk about free speech, we aren't talking about, as John said, the liberty to say whatever we want, whenever we want, in whatever context we happen to be in. That's just not how free speech functions. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater.
Unless there's a fire, then shout fire.
That's right. That's the important corollary to that point. But otherwise, if you shout fire, it's a felony, I think. Like you go to prison for that. And so you can see the ways in which, if you had let's say a town park where every weekend 100 groups came out to hand out leaflets to everyone in the park, how massively annoying that would be to all of the citizens who are walking through the park. And in those sorts of contexts, you could see a kind of blanket ban on leaflets of any type. Now, if they are not applying that broadly so that it's leaflets of any type, then that absolutely is a free speech infringement,
yes.
Right? Like if they picked out the Christian kids who are handing out the Christian literature and are like, no, not you, you might offend someone, but there's someone, who's a member of the yoga club down the way that's handing out yoga literature, and they're like, yeah, whatever, that's yoga.
I agree.
You win the lawsuit.
Yeah.
Like they lose, and the city should not do that. So, but that's where it does depend on whether the city would have a blanket ban on that type, on speech of the pamphlet form in Millennium Park. I think, but I will just say, if Millennium Park is a no proselytization zone, that's nuts. That just strikes me as a ludicrous thing for a city to expect from a park that is designed to deepen and enhance democratic engagement. So the fountains at Millennium Park that have the pictures of the different citizens, the whole park is designed to be an embodiment of democratic ideals. And if it's the case that free speech is not prohibited there in pamphlet form, or proselytization is prohibited there, that would just be massively ironic and troubling.
And I'll say that if it is the case that it is a no pamphleting zone, I will spend more time there this weekend, because I like to go to the park and not be bothered by people. But that's just me.
Misanthrope.
Yeah, I am. So.
I think there's someone over here with a question. Yes, okay.
Hi. When, John, you were talking about the love the centerpiece, but then you got talking about, hey, we're all flawed, and it just kind of made me wonder. This is going to touch in maybe to the joy of your philosophy background, but I think both of you could answer this. How do we know that something is flawed? What measure are both of you using when we say like maybe a society or something's not good for society? We're saying it's flawed somehow. So what would be the measure that both of you would use when you're deciding something is flawed?
So I'm going to give the sort of general answer of human well-being or human flourishing. And then, of course, the devil is in the details on that, how we figure out the kinds of things that enrich or enhance human flourishing as opposed to detract from it is part of why we engage in the moral conversation. It's a way of figuring that out. When I was religious, I would have filled in that picture a little bit more as God providing the standards, but even then, God providing the standard for human flourishing, which then gave us some indications as to what divine intentions were.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we can argue about these matters is because we both think there's a right and wrong answer to the question. We both think that there's ways of talking about what would constitute flaws or sins or wrong deeds or acts that can be right and that can be wrong. and that those aren't just wholly matters of private judgment, which we can't weigh up or evaluate. And so I think that's a really valuable piece, because without that, I don't think we can really argue in quite the same way. If John just thought this was all a matter of private judgment, I'd have nothing to say to him in one way, because I think the possibility of persuasion wouldn't exist. So in terms of how we do that, I have a very similar answer to John. There's something about human flourishing, human well-being. I'm a theologian, and so I am going to answer that question within specifically theological premises. I'm going to say something like the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the key which unlocks the moral order of creation and discloses the nature of human flourishing and happiness. It reveals what that is in its perfection and its fullness. And ultimately, and that word ultimately is key, any form of life which isn't in conformity with that is flawed to some degree or another. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that we can say, because there are lots of things that aren't ultimate. There are lots of penultimate things that would be before the ultimate. And so there are lots of ways in which we can talk about wrongs and a lack of human flourishing without direct reference to Jesus Christ. If I steal all of John's money, I'll be very happy, but we'll have done something wrong. But I will be happy.
You're not going to be that happy. I'm a philosophy professor. I don't make that much money. But to underscore a point that you made, when we were talking earlier about phrases that annoy us, one of the ones on our list is, you shouldn't judge other people.
Yeah.
I mean, really? So, like, if that means you shouldn't go around wagging your finger in people's faces, well, of course, that's annoying. That's not going to be very productive. But if you mean you should never make judgments, moral judgments about what other people are doing, no, that's part of being like a responsible grown-up in the world, as we decide, what kinds of things we want to uphold, what kinds of things we're willing to tolerate, and what kinds of things that we must forbid. And so we're both okay with judgment.
And the difference between us is that I have a degree in Christian ethics, which sanctions me to make my judgments in the name of Jesus Christ.
And
so
I have a degree in unchristian ethics, which just sanctions me to make judgments.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
By the way, that's a joke. I have lots of jokes about my degree. I mean, I also joke that if you need some divinely sanctioned reasons to do what you were going to do anyways, I'm the guy you call. I'm the rationalization expert. So it's what I do. Save me. Ask a question.
Yes.
It'll come.
It'll come. Just start talking. It'll happen.
There we go.
Okay. So I want to ping back to religious liberty and colleges, Christian colleges. There's a Supreme Court case coming up, and I think it's being argued either next week or the week after that. And Wheaton signed on to a joint brief submitted to the court, arguing that Christian universities, it was from the CCCU, Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, and Wheaton signed on to it, that Christian universities are engaged in the expression of the First Amendment when they hire people for their faculty at the university. And so then they should have the right to discriminate on the basis of employment for people's sexual orientation, assuming that Wheaton's a non-affirming school, right? So this is extremely painful for me because I don't go to Wheaton, I go to a different college, but a Christian college that explicitly, on the basis of my sexual orientation, discriminated against me in hiring. Even though, and this is crucial to my question I'm going to ask, I'm also non-affirming and I'm committed to Christian celibacy. So I think that there's a disconnect between the language that's being asked of Christian colleges and then the actual stance that's being taken in Christian colleges. And the disconnect uniquely harms people in my position. And I think a way around this, and I want to ask your feedback on this idea, is if Christian universities say, we won't discriminate on the basis of sheer sexual orientation or just sexual orientation itself. I wonder if the left is, or people that are affirming of same-sex marriage are overstating the case, over pushing the bounds by saying you need to hire people that of any sexual orientation, when that's not actually the categories that Christians are thinking in. Christians are dividing between action and attraction and saying, or action and acted attraction, and saying that we shouldn't be married to the same sex. So I'm kind of caught in the web because my university, which again is not Wheaton, I don't go here, my university wants to be able to maintain the ability to discriminate on sexual orientation. I don't want them to be able to do that. I want them to be able to discriminate on the basis of agreeing with the statement on marriage and sexuality that they have, which only talks about the practice of marriage. So what do you think about the distinction? Do you think that's a legitimate distinction, or do you think that that's just immediately an illegitimate distinction, and then universities should have to fit within the category of orientation or not orientation for how they hire?
Important clarification as an employee of Wheaton College myself. If a person is same-sex attracted and holds the traditional position, that's not going to impact whether you get a job or not.
At Wheaton.
So I just want to, yes.
At Wheaton,
So,
yeah.
Yes, at Wheaton, yes. So I just want to clarify, because the way you stated it was, if you identify in some way, and you say identify but you're non-affirming, then you can't get a job at Wheaton College. That's not true. There is something. Yeah, I know, but I just want to be clear.
Yeah, that's an important clarification
I
for
just want to be
Wheaton's
clear
sake.
about that specific
Right.
thing in terms of Wheaton's hiring policy.
Yeah,
So,
that's important.
yeah.
So I'm going to let Matt be the main person to answer this question.
Dang it.
But I'm going to point out how this is a good example of how very nuanced categories tend to get smushed together in public discourse and the law, and very broad brushes get used. So, what makes a person have a certain sexual orientation? Is it simply the sex or gender of the people that they're attracted to vis-a-vis their own sex and gender, or does it have something to do with their self-identity, or does it have something to do with their publicly proclaimed self-identity, or does it have something to do with whether they are in or willing to be in a kind of relationship with people of the same sex? I mean, those are all different kinds of positions, and simply referring to all of that as sexual orientation papers over those nice distinctions.
Yeah.
Now you do the hard part.
Yeah. This is a really good question. Thanks for asking it.
Yes.
I'll have to think about the distinction that you draw more between discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and discriminating on the basis of mere sexual orientation, if I understood that right. I think it's absolutely the case that insofar as one can have a sexual orientation that we would describe as gay or lesbian, and can live faithfully within the boundaries of Christian orthodoxy. I think you're right that Christian colleges shouldn't discriminate on the basis of mere sexual orientation, but discriminate on the basis of adherence to, commitment to the practices of chastity, the practices of faithful sexual obedience to the gospel. That said, I think it's an interesting instance of the ways in which the culture war magnifies certain problems within our own community around how we form people on these issues. And it makes it much harder to form people in ways that are, I think, in line with traditional Christian teaching about sexual ethics. It seems to me that a college that would decline to hire someone who was unambiguously traditional in their sexual ethics, who was fully committed to the truth of historic Christian teaching on those ethics, that a college that would decline to do that because this person was also gay probably has a sense of anxiety about their own position in the world, and has naturally decided to take a much sharper stand than they may have needed to take otherwise. And there's collateral damage when institutions do that. But I think we're seeing that across many institutions within conservative Christian circles. They're taking sometimes more aggressively conservative stance than I think they need to, in part because the challenges that are coming from the law and coming from the broader culture are very real, right? The central challenges to religious liberty for conservative Christians are not derived from what's happening in the courts, right? What happens in the courts is important, don't get me wrong, but the central challenges to religious liberty arise from what's happening on Facebook and what's happening on nextdoor.com and what's happening in our ordinary relations with one another within this culture, and the generally pervasive sense that religion is not just not special, but religion is actively harmful to people, right? That cultural attitude is a far more significant threat to religious liberty than anything that John Roberts or Sonia Sotomayor could do. And I think that that intuitive awareness by a lot of conservative Christians has prompted them to try to fight back in ways that have caused collateral damage as a result. And so that's a non-answer to your question, but it might give you something to think about. We can talk more later.
Matt, do you think that because some certain denominations this past year have passed resolutions that have apparently taken aim at people like someone else who is speaking on this campus tomorrow?
It's not going to name names.
And I'm not using names, but people who will use the phrase gay Christian, it would appear that may trickle down to institutions associated with those denominations. It's not clear that it is. Yeah. In which case, the situation that you're talking about would actually happen, irrespective of what a person says that they believe. That's because there's a commitment to saying, whatever you say about your practice, because you use this label, you're not really saying that. You're not really saying that. Yeah.
That's exactly right. That is precisely my concern. There are lots of Christians who can fully live within a traditional Christian sexual ethic and who still call themselves gay. And that category of people is, I think, being pushed out by very, very anxious communities.
Which, in a way, reinforces the starker contrast and the greater polarization. So you're either on this side or you're on this side, and there's no sort of in-between positions that one can take.
That's right.
Question is, what is sex for? What is sex not for? Who gets to decide and why? Anyway, simple question.
Well, I appreciate simple questions. So I'd go back to the general framework of human flourishing and talk about the ways in which sex can contribute to human flourishing or detract from human flourishing. I think one of the things that the right wing gets right, at least to a degree, is the point that, look, sex is a very powerful force, and sex at times leads otherwise thought and decent and smart people to do really bad things. And we were talking about some politicians earlier. You can point to lots of examples in the news. But it's a powerful force, and like lots of powerful forces, it needs various constraints to direct it productively in people's lives. Having said that, I'm going to disagree with Matt and lots of other people about what those constraints should be. So for example, I don't think it is just for having children or for this kind of union between a man and a woman that can be of the sort to have children. I think it also can be for expression of and building of intimacy. I think it can be a way of communicating affection. I think it can be a way of experiencing and providing pleasure. I think those can all be valuable and beautiful things within the context of a relationship that is conducive to human flourishing. But I still think that there are constraints that are generated by that framework?
Yeah, we do disagree on this. And
Shocking.
This is amazingly,
Shocking.
right? So I think that I agree with everything that John included in his list of things that sex can be for. It can be for intimacy, and it can be for pleasure, and it can be for the deepening of human relationships, and so on and so forth. The fundamental question is whether within all of that, it must also be only expressed in a way that would have some close intrinsic connection to procreation. And it seems to me that the position of procreation and sexual ethics and in the debate about marriage is it's one of the points at which conservatives struggled to make their arguments the most, which is unsurprising. It's probably the aspect of marriage that everything turns on. And so from my standpoint, if I came up with an argument for why procreation had to be a necessary constituent, necessary part of a sexual relation, the immediate rejoinder is, well, does that mean all the time, every single act? Does that mean that those who know they're infertile can't be married because marriage as such has to be for procreation? And the thing is that marriage is for procreation, and marriage is a form of union that is embodied within the sexual act. But that doesn't mean that every sexual act embodies every aspect of the marriage. It just can't oppose or contradict certain aspects of the marriage. And so there's, within the Christian tradition, there are certain acts that contradict the unitive ends of marriage. If you get married and you have an affair with someone, you contradict, in one sense, the unitive end of marriage. You are not uniting with your spouse. There are also acts that contradict the procreative end. If you engage in solo sexuality, masturbatory acts, to be blunt, you're contradicting, not just failing to fulfill, but in one sense contradicting the procreative end. And I think that distinction is extremely hard for people to wrap their heads around, and it's extremely hard for me to be able to persuade someone as to why that's the case in each of those instances. But without that, it seems to me the argument can't go through, and I think that's where we just disagree.
I was about to ask you, can you say more about the distinction between contradicts versus simply fails to fulfill?
Yeah.
Because I can recognize that these acts fail to fulfill those other ends, but contradict, why contradict?
No, I'm not sure I can, right?
Yeah, you're right.
So I think contradict because within a form of an act, acts have forms that we choose. And those forms are set for us. We don't get to establish for ourselves the meaning of our acts in one way. We pick acts, what we do, off the clothing rack, so to speak, right? I'm either going to do something intelligible by walking down the stairs, or I'm going to do something intelligible by sitting here and talking with you. But in each case, you know what I'm doing because we have a common reference. There's a form that I am acting within. And I think that the form of solo sexuality is actually just fundamentally a different form of act than a procreative union.
Then it's not on the rack.
Yeah,
It's not there to be chosen.
It's not there to be chosen, right? It's a different in kind in one way. And this is where,
Do you think that we need theological premises to establish that?
I hope not, but I'm open to it.
Okay.
I'm open to it. And this is where, trying to understand sex and marriage, this is why I said at the outset, conservatives struggled, because we are digging down to first premises, basic, fundamental commitments that we have about the universe and trying to explain them. It's like trying to explain 2 + 2 = 4. Just really hard.
I see there are a couple more people standing.
Yeah.
At some
There
point,
are
I'd like a couple.
So we're okay, a couple more questions is good?
I'm great for a couple more questions, and at some point, I'd like 2 minutes to wrap up. And
Yeah,
you
sure.
maybe-
Okay,
Two more questions, then we'll wrap
I have a small question
Oh,
after
no.
theirs.
A small question after theirs, is that going to be?
I think
I don't believe you.
I think you can answer it briefly.
Okay, okay. All right.
we'll hear
And then,
theirs.
and we appreciate, we want to be respectful of your time as well. After we're done answering these questions and having a quick little wrap up, we'll be around standing in the lobby, so we can, if you want to chat with us further. We really appreciate your taking the time to be with us tonight.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, this is delightful. I'm walking away tonight thinking, I'm an evangelical, but how do I have more friends like John to dialogue with? So I'm curious
I'm
about...
not thinking that. I'm done. You can
Yeah.
have him.
Oh, that's great.
Easy after tonight, apparently. Take me out for beers. That's no.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Anyway.
I'm curious about, John, your thoughts on Obergefell. So I assume that you were quite happy with the results of the decision, but were you happy with the way that the decision came about?
Do you mean Justice Kennedy's pristine rhetoric, perhaps? No.
Yeah, well, even what you're showing for us now, I mean, it seems like part of the conservative complaint is that Obergefell assumed that we are all talking about the same thing when we use the word marriage. And so the complaint is that it's not part of the judicial branch's duties to define or redefine marriage. That's a legislative thing that should be constitutional. There should be an amendment. And since that wasn't there, the Supreme Court should not have ruled at all.
So I'm not going to go that far, unsurprisingly, because I think that this point about the definition of marriage, while I agree with you that in deciding whether same-sex couples are allowed to marry, we have to have some sense of what it means to marry, right? There must be some definition of what that is. My own sense as a non-lawyer is that if I were writing the opinion, I would have spent less time on due process considerations and more time on equal protection, suggesting that, look, we let all kinds of people legally marry, even though they don't fit this model of conjugal union that is what marriage is supposed to be, according to people like Justice Alito and others, and Robbie George and Ryan Anderson and Sharif Girgis and people that I've debated. So they have this notion of marriage as conjugal union. It must be between a man and a woman, otherwise we're not talking about marriage. Well, legally speaking, that's not, in fact, the way we treat marriage in our society. And if we're not going to treat marriage in our society that way, it seems inconsistent and thus a violation of the equal protection of the laws to not allow same-sex couples to marry. But I'm not on the Supreme Court and never will be. So that said, I also want to say, and repeat something I said earlier, that Obergefell decided something legally, but it's one thing to have the legal right to marry. It's another thing for your parents to show up at your wedding and be happy for you. And to me, that's also an important part of what marriage is, which is one reason why I think the marriage debate is not entirely over, because there are aspects of marriage as a social institution that need further discussion and more buy-in.
My name is Anna. I'm a junior here at Wheaton College, and I'm from Southern California. I have found in my own experience, both here and at home, that a lack of a certain degree of affirmity for LGBTQ identifying students is incredibly dangerous. In 2018, a man from my hometown was murdered for his sexuality. Historically here at Wheaton, some students have been isolated and even physically assaulted for their sexuality. Wheaton employs the rhetoric of, quote, people affected by same-sex attraction, end quote, when talking about the LGBTQ community, effectively ending any constructive discussions on the administrative level here at Wheaton. How would you both suggest that we have this discussion safely and publicly rather than exclusively behind closed doors and lectures that are sometimes barely advertised? How can we evolve this discussion so that it happens across every part of the Wheaton community, including the administration?
So once again, I'm going to let you primarily answer this question, but here's why. I think of myself very much as an outsider here, and I want to take a moment to thank you for your gracious welcoming of me as an outsider. I am unapologetically a gay man in a romantic relationship with another man for the last 18 years. When I hear, people affected with same-sex attraction, I'm like, ooh, what is that? I mean, it's just scary. I mean, it's like that's just not a way that I speak. It's not it's not very familiar to my experience at this point in my life. And so the fact that you would welcome me to be up here with Matt and to talk freely and candidly about my own experience, which is very much not in line with the expressed values of the institution, is something that I'm grateful for. I do think that one thing I would point out is that while you're not going to find somebody like me on this campus every day talking about his life and experience, the internet is just a few clicks away in terms of like getting to know people and their stories and a bigger picture of what's out there in the world in terms of people's experience on this. Because I agree with you that how we talk about this issue matters. It makes a difference. And when we say things like people affected with same-sex attraction, making it seem like a kind of disease or something, that matters. That makes a difference.
Thanks for filibustering for me. I'm not sure I have much to say. Okay. I think it's a given. I mean, it's tragic that what should be a given would have to be said, but violence against LGBT people is intrinsically morally wrong. It is wrong. Full stop. Unequivocally. And that's because they're persons made in God's image. And I do think there's a sense in which where reasons for that kind of violence come out of specifically like anti-LGBT sentiment, it's actually somewhat worse than just ordinary violence, right? In the same way that I think aborting an embryo because it's a woman or will be a woman is in one way just worse because you're saying something in that act about how you see women just above and beyond how you see a person just as such. Or aborting an embryo because it might be deaf, or aborting an embryo because it has Down syndrome. I think that those are in one way worse choices because of their expressive significance. And in that sense, I think violence against LGBTQ individuals, because they are those, is worse than just ordinary violence. I won't speak for the administration by any means, and I'm no one's representative on this issue, so I'm just a guy. But I will say that the open conversations about these issues is really hard in an environment where culturally the endpoint of the conversation that people want to move to has been made clear from the outset. I'm not saying that's true here at Wheaton. I'm saying generally the trajectory on these issues is going entirely in one direction. And so what counts as a conversation is, for many contexts, largely just the beginnings of an attempt to move an entire institution to a place that the institution would distance that institution from its historical convictions on a matter. The way in which broadly and culturally people have moved away from historical convictions on marriage. And so that broader culture environment actually makes, I think, conversations that need to be had much, much harder if those conversations are being had in good faith. And so I actually think there's a lot of wisdom to doing as much as you can privately, behind closed doors. We are not, I'm old, and I think, like, still in the generation that just didn't like a certain kind of politicking. But what happens behind closed doors is far more influential and powerful in this world than what gets done in public. And that seems to be a lesson, I think, that certainly like my college students that I teach at Baylor have totally forgotten. And so like the diplomacy is a long-term project. Change is never fast. And if you are interested in that kind of conversation, I think that you should undertake it in ways that are sensitive to Wheaton's historical convictions and that respect those. And that's really hard. I think that's not going to make anyone happy in this sort of conversation. But I will just say, within the Christian world, one of the great frustrations that I have is that we think that within Scripture, and I'm just going to be explicitly theological, we have somehow come to think that within Scripture and within the boundaries of the Christian tradition, the question of gay marriage is complicated. It's not. It's just not. I've read all the books defending gay marriage from a theological standpoint. The arguments are just not good. But the thing is, they're just good enough to create confusion, and once they create confusion, they open a doorway such that in order to, for us to all get along, we end up having to be kind of affirming as a community, because it's something that we can agree to disagree on. And so that trajectory where you start with confusion and you move towards a kind of affirmation is, I think, founded on this premise that the arguments are good, and they're just not. And that's just an assertion based on my authority, and we can have all those arguments afterwards, and I would love to do that. But I just don't think the arguments are very good. And I think that if we recognize that, the nature of the conversation has to change considerably.
I don't know where to go with any of that. Yeah. So, did you have one final question?
I did.
Okay.
So this has been a great, respectful conversation. Sometimes people have said, in order to disagree well, one of the things that can get in the way of disagreeing well and disagreeing truthfully is by talking about being civil. And I'm just curious about whether, is civil a bad word when it comes to disagreeing well? Or is there a way of being civil that accomplishes being truthful, bringing your best arguments, but being mutually respectful, even if you don't agree on anything at the end, but you leave respecting each other?
So I've kind of gone up and down on my feelings about civility and how that plays out in the debate. On the one hand, I think Matt and I come together to try to model a kind of civil discourse, and not just for the sake of putting on a show, but because we really mean it. This is how we talk to each other off stage.
Yeah.
I might cuss a little bit more when we're off stage, but and not at Wheaton. But this is how we talk to each other off stage. On the other hand, civility sometimes gets used as a way of silencing marginalized voices. When people speak up against grave injustices, instead of focusing on the substance of their complaints, we talk about how they raise the complaint. You're just not being civil, and you need to calm down and get it. And that bothers me, because there are times when it's appropriate to be angry. There are times when it's appropriate to raise a fuss. There's times when one needs to raise one's voice in order to get appropriate attention on certain issues. I think what we're trying to do is to point out that you don't always need to have the volume turned up full tilt, that there is room for, call it if you will, civil discussion. And that part of the value of that is that it builds a certain trust. That trust allows a certain vulnerability. It allows a willingness for a real give and take. So, look, Matt was just talking about his views on, interpretation of Scripture. I am by no means an expert on that, but to the extent that I know some of the arguments about which he's speaking, I completely disagree with him on his read on some of those arguments. I think it's possible for us to completely disagree about certain things and to do so passionately and strenuously and still be able to be in relationship as friends. I wish more people would do that because I think we'd make more progress in society as a result.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. Civility is, as John said, it can be used in such a way that it represses or pushes down those who are angry and who are crying out for redress, right? Those who are raising their laments and their grievances against the world. And there's a form of speech that I think is also appropriate to political action. I mean, I said a very strong thing in saying that I don't think there's a good argument theologically on behalf of gay marriage. It's a really strong rhetorical move that a lot of people would say is deeply disrespectful to a lot of people who have worked through those issues and come to other, different positions. And I think when I look at our Lord and Savior, there are lots of moments in the Gospels that just seem downright uncivil. There are lots of moments. And when he is interacting with the Pharisees, he does not refrain even from insults. And I would like to be like our Lord and Savior, which means I don't want to be more pure and more pious than he is, which means that I need to have room for a type of rhetoric that is stern, that's strong, and that's pointed at, by and large, those who would be institutional gatekeepers and would be leading the people of Israel astray. And I think when you think about public rhetoric and political rhetoric in that way, civility becomes uninteresting, right? Our job as Christians is to tell the truth about the world and to tell the truth about the world in ways that draw people to listen. Now, this can go badly, and it does all the time in my own life, and I am a poor practitioner of it. When people, I may have a personal policy of when people are deeply uncivil to me on Twitter, of meeting them with the same sort of incivility. I may have told myself for a long time that it actually works it out of me so that when I go home, I'm more civil to my wife. I need a kind of pressure valve where I release all my incivility on anonymous Twitter people who just spew all sorts of things.
I just drink.
He just drinks, right? So it can go badly, but I do think that there is a way in which our speech has to take into account direct confrontations that increasingly we just don't have room for.
So a few final words from Matt and John?
This is really hard. It's all really hard, and I'm really grateful for John's patience with me. I've always loved arguing with him. As he said, I do think that this is how we talk off stage. And it seems to me that as we move into the future as a people, as America does, that one of the things that we desperately need is a sense of commonality. The places that we have in common are disappearing. And we need a sense of that we are neighbors, and that because we're neighbors, because God has brought us together, even by chance, that we have to be able to find goods that we can share and participate in together, whatever those are. And this sort of deliberative discourse, this sort of arguing is, to me, essential for finding those common goods and finding our way to a sense of being a common people again. And so as much as I disagree with John, I'm very thankful that he's willing to do that.
I'm very grateful for you as well. If I had two sort of final bits of advice for all of you, one is to keep in mind what really matters. I think we get so caught up in the culture wars and so caught up on Twitter and all of that, that we forget that those are not the end, right? That those are a means to an end. The reason we engage in that kind of thing at all should be because we care about people. We care about how this is going to affect people's lives. And I think it's worthwhile to step back every once in a while and focus on the people we care about. Turn off social media, put it away, and focus on the people. Which brings me to the second bit of advice, because student groups will sometimes ask me, it's like, so, we want to have more of this thoughtful dialogue. It's like, should we have a debate? Should we have a panel? And I say, you should have pizza. Because if you don't like pizza, you're a moral monster and get away from it. No. What I mean there is focus on building relationships first. Focus on getting to know people, because then, again, you build that sort of space of trust where you can have real conversation, as opposed to this sort of nervous and tentative thing where we put forth the sound bites. And then if you want to have that kind of deep conversation, if you want to have that kind of deep listening, focus on building relationship first. And I am very grateful for the relationship that I have built with Matt over the years. And I'm very grateful to you here at Wheaton for welcoming us both tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please join me.